So good evening, everybody. So yes, as Darren said, my name's Liz Jennifer. I'm going to be speaking this evening about how to deal with too little or too much grass. So the plan for this evening is to really start talking about what supply and demand is. So it's sort of talking about the principles of why we might have too much or too little, factors affecting grass growth, and also this spring we've seen a range of those factors sort of represented, and so we'll talk a bit about through that. And then we'll talk a bit through the options, so what happens if you've got too much or too little. It's a bit like Goldilocks, so some of you may have optimum, but the challenge we've got at the moment, particularly for this spring, is that for some people we've been quite short. It's been driven by many factors which we'll come on to, but all of a sudden, because of the rain that we've just had in the last day or so, that will change quite rapidly now. And then because of the situation we've had this spring, just to think about what could be done differently next year. And I accept that every season seems to be very different at the moment, but just to make a note of some stuff that you might want to do differently over the autumn and winter to set you up for this spring. Sorry, for next spring, and then there'll be a bit of a summary. So just to sort of hint at activity so this is a project run by Farming Connect looking at these range of locations, and that it provides you with grass growth information. So the website you can see at the bottom, and you basically hover over the area and it'll give you the recent grass growth information and also give you some history. So if you're not measuring grass already, there is information out there. So this is one source that's that can be useful. So these farmers would be measuring grass using a plate meter every week. There's also sward sticks available. So there's a range of techniques available to measure grass, but probably, well, cheapest is the sword stick because the plate meter is about £600. And what these farmers would be doing is measuring a representative proportion of their fields. Some of them might be measuring all fields, and to get an idea of what's happening from the previous week. What's important at this time of year in terms of measuring grass is that we're really interested to know how quick, because it can change quite quickly. It's so measuring every couple of weeks on most farms would be most beneficial. This is just another example of some data this is actually from across Great Britain. So this project is funded by AHCB and HTC and QMS from a beef and lamb perspective, and others from the dairy side. And so so this graph here talks about what grass growth is doing, and what's useful about this, it has a comparison with what was happening this time last year. So the blue line on this chart is what the average farm grass growth was for these 50 farms across GB last year. And then you've got the yellow line, which is beef and sheep farms this year, there's about 28 of them across GB, and the green line, which is dairy farms. So the general message really early on in this season was that our grass growth was below what we saw last year. And for beef and sheep farms, we were below what the grass growth that you were seeing on dairy farms. When you start to pull out the information, because it's in obviously England, Wales and Scotland, you can start to get geographical distributions, and generally Wales is very much beating everybody else in terms of what their grass growth is doing, but you generally are below where those dairy farms are. There's a combination of factors for that. So early on, the issue was generally cold, wet soils. So we'll talk a bit about soil temperature. We then probably moved through a period that if stock was out, that actually leaf area was reduced. So stock was grazing it quite tight. Leaf area was reduced, therefore it was challenging for that grass to recover. We then moved through a phase of probably getting a bit too dry. And so that's what also affected some growth. And you can see there's been some recovery in the last few weeks from a beef and sheep perspective, probably a couple of weeks behind where the dairy is. And then again, it'll be interesting to see what those results look like in a week's time. And alongside, I suppose, ground conditions also delayed some nitrogen applications on farm, which also probably had an impact. So, as I said, this spring has been a beautiful combination of all of the issues in terms of what's sort of reducing grass growth. So again, this curve is updated every week and can be found if you Google grass track GB. So we've got sorry, what I should have said is this is in kilos of dry matter per hectare per day, and that's what the y-axis is along the side. So that's the supply. That's how much grass growth is being supplied to those animals. We also need to think in terms of, you might have fodder beet with them, you might have silage with them, depending on how much forage is there. You might have other things that are providing those kilos of dry matter to those animals. But this is what's coming from grass. So at the moment, we're sort of, on average, beef and sheep farms looking around about 30 kilos of dry matter per hectare per day from grass alone. So then what does that actually mean when we talk in terms of stocking rate? So then along this, we've got 10, 20, 30, 40 and 50, and that's kilos of dry matter in terms of demand. So it relates back to what we've just looked at in terms of growth. So we can see we're about 30 kilos in terms of growth at the moment. And that means if we were stocking at about 5.5 ewes per acre, they would be just about keeping up. So they would basically, what is being grown is they are requiring most of the time. It's not quite as simple as that, but I mean, that's the general premise. So obviously if the grass growth is 10 and 1.5 ewes, it can support 1.5 ewes per acre, or a quarter of a set cow. You get them in that proportion. And as grass growth increases, obviously stocking rate increases. So the challenge we're getting this year, and why there's been some concern about grass supply being tight, is generally people have put out at the standard stocking rate, assuming that it will be growing to them. And as you can see from this previous slide, we've had this delay in grass growth this spring. And so a lot of people have been experiencing this tight grass supply at this time of year. And as I said, and then recovery time has been reduced because we've eaten quite a lot of the leaf out, because there wasn't as much around as we would like. So thinking about what is being supplied by the grass, and then also thinking in terms of what is the demand from those animals. This next slide is something to look at in terms of in more detail once you get a copy of the presentation, but it basically goes through the same principle, and it was developed because I got bored of trying to answer questions about livestock units per hectare, demand, use per hectare, use per acre, and so this sort of combines it into one table. But again, it's worth looking at when you've got a bit more time to see what your current stocking rate is, what your demand is, and what's the equivalent in terms of livestock units. So if you think into a spring block dairy type system, they would be chasing a livestock unit equivalent per hectare of sort of over 2, aiming towards 2.5. So they are at that sort of bottom end of where that table is. For a lot of sheep systems, we're sort of aiming sort of mid-table really, and there's certain examples where we would be shifting that stocking rate up. So then if we come to those factors affecting growth, and we've seen soil temperature, we've discussed it. So for a perennial ryegrass, it really starts growing around about 5 degrees Celsius, clover around about 8. So it's not really until the last few weeks where soils were drying out that allowed that soil temperature to actually rise. And at the moment, it's at a very healthy level in terms of what that temperature is doing. It will be chilled a bit as the rain comes, but then it will drive grass growth. So what does affect soil temperature is also compaction. So if you've got soil structural issues, it can hold the moisture in, so therefore lowering the temperature artificially. So that's just worth thinking about, that if there's certain fields that have struggled more than others, it might be worth just having a look in terms of from a soil structural perspective, which we'll talk about in a second. Soil moisture we've touched on just then, and again that has had some limiting impact in certain regions in the last few weeks, that it went from being very wet to very dry in about a week, and that has been limiting grass growth, and we'll talk about what that impact will be. We've talked a bit about amount of leaf, and I'll show some images on that, and then also we'll touch on nutrients. So the other thing to just talk about at this stage is that it's another Farming Connect project on soil temperature, and these are the sites. And again, similar to what we saw in the pasture growth rates, you can hover over the particular area and it'll give you the information and also the history of those sites. So again, it's quite useful if you're not measuring soil temperatures yourselves. You can try and find a site near where you are that is, and get that information. So the key factor is for perennial ryegrass and to start growing, it needs to be above 5 degrees. Timothy grows at a slightly lower temperature, but in terms of nitrogen application, the general advice is that it needs to be 5 degrees for 5 consecutive days for that nitrogen application to be useful. We've certainly passed that point now. So this graph is just quite a bit of information, and I'll talk you through it. So this actually comes from GrassCheck Northern Ireland. So it's the sister, really, of GrassCheck GB. And they've been running a few more years, so I've got some information through that really dry year of 2018. So what we see here, the blue bars at the bottom is the actually weekly rainfall. So you can see that most of those farms did get, across those counties of Northern Ireland, there was some rain most weeks. The orange line is soil moisture, and so it's sort of, you have to think about it in reverse. The higher the soil moisture number, actually the less soil moisture there is in that ground. So you can see there's a big peak around week 13 and 14. And when we get for how this soil moisture is sort of represented, when you get over 60, which is sort of the first line at the bottom, is 50. So as you get over a point of 60, it's starting to affect grass growth. So you can see that the impact that first peak where it went over 50 happened around about week 8 or 9. Then it sort of dropped down below 60 again, and then it increased quite rapidly as a line. And then behind that, you can see the green line is grass growth. And that's again in kilos of dry matter per hectare per day, which is what we were looking at before in terms of grass growth. And you can see how, unsurprisingly, as that soil moisture increased above that 60 threshold, that grass growth was really limited for quite a significant period of time. So probably from week 10 of this data set all the way through to about week 18, 19, it was affected. And again, this is in Northern Ireland, traditionally quite a high rainfall area. So again, it's not really surprising that soil moisture is having that impact, but it's just nice to see that how long it can have that impact for and how dramatic it can be. So the other thing we've touched about in terms of soil moisture, there is an element, it works both ways in terms of moisture. So if there is a structural issue, it can hold the moisture for too long and cause issues in terms of soil temperature. But also what we like from a structural perspective is to make sure that water and nutrients can move through the soil and therefore promote as much grass growth as possible. The other thing that affects soil moisture is how much organic matter is within those soils, and that sort of acts as a bit of a sponge to hold that moisture within that soil. And again, when we're talking about relatively long-term grassland, organic matter generally isn't an issue, but certainly on some reseeds, it might be a limiting factor in terms of retention of moisture. So when we dig holes, it could be that when we're doing some soil tests, or it could be that we've found some problems in some fields, we're looking for good levels of worm activity, and that is a range of ages, and that's really indicated by size. So we want to see big ones and small ones. We want to see ones that are sexually matured, and that's really that's shown by having the saddle that you see on the back of them. And we're also after a range of species, and there's quite a lot of resources out there to sort of help identify worm species. And you also want to see a reasonable number, and that will be driven a bit by how much moisture is around. And the guidance really on identifying if you've got enough is to do it at the same time of year every year, and you're sort of in a cube that's sort of the width of a spade. You're looking for anywhere above 10 is a really good indicator. We're also looking to see whether any roots are restricted, and that's about movement of moisture and nutrients through up and down that soil profile. And we're also looking to see what colour it is. What we don't want to see is this sort of grey or mottling type colour on soils, and that's again indicating mild waterlogging. And this is sort of, we'll talk about later on, which is thinking about identifying problems this spring that you might have to deal with in the autumn, and that will help next spring. So some of this is not about a magic wand, it's just also identifying problem areas or problem fields that do need some action or some focus over this year, and hopefully benefiting into next spring. And what we also like to see, and again is a really good indicator of problems with soil, is this sort of horizontal cracking. What we prefer is this vertical. And again, it's really easy to see as you start digging some holes. Again, it's a bit of a busy slide, but we'll talk through it. So we've talked a bit about the amount of leaf, and a lot of the time, in the last few weeks, some of the concerns about grass growth is because there just hasn't been enough leaf, particularly where people have been lambing in March, sort of early March into beginning of April. Basically, sheep have taken all the leaf area off. So when grass gets below about 4 centimetres, it takes a lot longer for that recovery. So below 4 centimetres in this, is you can see, is called the lag phase. Basically, it's just taken a long time to get itself ready for growth again. As soon as we hit 4 centimetres, it moves into this, what this is called log phase, and so basically it just really, really rapidly ramps away. And then when it gets to about 12 to 15 centimetres, depending on the type of sward, it starts to sort of decrease, and then it enters a bit of a steady state. It might not quite flatline like this, but what happens, it starts to shade itself out. So there's a lot of leaf there. It's actually stopping the other leaves intercepting sunlight. So it's basically creating its own shade, which is why that growth rate starts to drop. So why rotational grazing systems, and we'll come on to it in a moment, work so well is because we tend to always be working between this sort of 4 centimetres and up to about 12, 15, depending on what your sort of pre-graze cover target should be. So, and that's why that rotational grazing systems really, really drives grass growth, is because you're always working in this really rapid phase of grass growth. And the challenge we get, which is when we go below 4 centimetres and then want that grass to really quickly respond, it just needs to get itself into the right stage, really. And so this slide here sort of indicates it. So what happens in terms of a grass plant is it puts a first leaf up, a second leaf up, a third leaf up, and then hopefully it's eaten and it starts that process again. And so if you are in a sort of overgrazing phase, you tend to, that grass plant's always in sort of first and second leaf stage. And what can happen, as you can sort of see, is that it doesn't really have a chance to build up its root reserves. So if there is a period of time where it gets too dry in the future, just might not just have quite enough reserves to then basically stay there. So that's when you get some plant death. So what we're really interested in rotational systems is we go from basically the third leaf stage, where it's optimum, back to that first leaf stage, give it some rest and recovery, and off it goes again. And that's why we see that increased growth rates in rotational grazing systems. The other thing just to think about is also to make sure your nutrients are right. So pH is fundamental in terms of making sure that nutrients are more available. So this indicates the wider the white line, the more available those nutrients, and we're really targeting pH of 6 to 6.2. So again, soil test, act on soil test, very important. And this sort of indicates that as soon as we drop below 6, we are getting this reduction in yield. So some of this yield impact of this spring could be driven by the weather, but it could be driven by the nutrients. So again, definitely check out your soil tests, and if you haven't done one in the last 3 or 4 years, then it's worth doing it again when at the appropriate time. And a lot of that is driven by when you last did it. So ideally, same time of year as the last ones were done. But again, focusing on pH is key for grassland systems. The other thing that we'll talk about is nitrogen. So this graph here comes from the AHTB's nutrient management guide, so known as RB209, and gives this indication of sort of response for nitrogen. So along the y-axis, you've got yield, and along the bottom, you've got nitrogen application. So as your nitrogen applications increase, yield increases. And it's split in terms of grass growth class, and that is generally driven by how much moisture is around, which is driven by rainfall, but also soil type. And so you can just start to have a look in terms of where your fields might be in terms of how much nitrogen you put on, and that also can be in the form of manures and slurries, and also white clover or red clover. White clover probably fixing between 100 to 150 kilos of nitrogen, red clover 150 to 200. So you can start to see where your fields might be in terms of annual yield, and both based on their grass growth class. And as I sort of mentioned before, nitrogen, some of the issue with nitrogen this year was actually getting it on at the right time, just because of ground conditions. And this slide, or this information coming out of NZ, just the thing we've also got to remember is is as grass starts to really motor, which we're getting at the moment, it's sort of about 30. So this is classed as moderate in terms of growth rates. For every kilo of nitrogen we put on, we're getting 10 kilos response rate. So we get a 1 to 10 response rate. If we put that nitrogen on earlier in the season, we might only get a 1 to 5 response rate. And as that grass growth starts to really increase into sort of middle of spring, we can get up as much as probably 1 to 15, extreme 1 to 20. So it's that sort of it's also return on investment. So when you put nitrogen onto that rapidly growing grass, you will get that bigger response rate. And also think about sulfur applications. So sulfur is there's a risk of sulfur deficiency, particularly in light soils and heavy rainfall areas, and it has a big yield impact if the deficiency is there, and probably more common in silage areas or silage lay, but again can be seen in grazing lays. And then it's thinking about what your sward height targets are. So this example up here is using lambs, so pre-graze versus post-graze, going in at sort of 8 to 10 and coming out for around about 4 to 6 under rotations. And then this is for cows and calves, so going in slightly higher, again based on how they graze. So they're sort of ripping at that grass and coming out at sort of 5 to 6, and it might be a bit lower depending on what your target is. And so there's rotational grazing for certain systems is very useful, and people have got confidence in that system. But again, continuous grazing, so where you're trying to maintain that sward height at sort of 4 to 6 for ewes and lambs, and anywhere between sort of 7 to 8 for cows, can be very effective, but it's not easy. It's not just bunging in some cows in some fields and letting them get on with it. It is about managing the numbers, managing the area, to making sure those sward heights are appropriate. So if the grass is growing too quickly, what are some options? So if you've got a mixed system, so you can bring cattle into those, and the advantage of cattle is that because they don't graze quite so short, that they do take off maybe some of the longer ends and improve the quality for sheep. You can, depending on what time of year it is, sort of shut some up and then strip graze it back. The challenge we've got with shutting land up now for strip grazing is that by the time you get to the end of the field, it's probably got away from you. So strip grazing is probably a better strategy to do later in the year, but again, it needs must. So if you just have to be prepared to ration that back, and the quality will be dropped. But again, for suckler cows, it could be a really useful option. The next example is sort of, again, that sort of deferred grazing, so probably more appropriate later in the year, but again, a lot of this is to do with which class of stock you're trying to graze. Silaging is always a good option. You've been taking that excess out and making it into silage. It could be that you're actually feeding it in situ, so it could be that that field is being allocated for sacrifice or forage crops later in the year. So it could be that you cut it and then leave it in the field for use later. And certainly common within the dairy sector is this pre-graze mow. So before those cows go in, they go through with a mower and just take off the seed heads and allow it to wilt for a bit, and then sort of control the grazing onto it, and the cattle will pick it up and utilise it. So it's just a way for the next time those cattle come into that paddock, the quality is back. And then in terms of too little, we have to really start to think about supplementation, which we know that there's a cost associated with that. But certainly ewe and lamb performance at this time of year will start to suffer if sward heights are below 4 centimetres, so 1500. And so this graph here, or image here, just indicates that if we're heading towards 3 centimetres, that we're looking at sort of supplementing, feeding them by about 400 grams per ewe per day. If it's getting below sort of 3, we're looking at almost 700 grams per day. And then as soon as it gets below sort of 3, 2.5, we're looking at also additional forages required to get that, to make sure that their requirements are being met. So it's worth just thinking of, and it doesn't necessarily have to be every group, so it's prioritising those animals. But certainly the key with ewes and lambs is as soon as it goes below 4 centimetres, then some supplementation is required. And it sort of also feeds into what we said before about if we're taking that grass too low all of the time, it just never gets that chance to recover, and you're actually limiting potential growth by grazing it too short. And then the important thing is then to try to start prioritising stock. So in a lot of systems, ewes and lambs are high priority at this time of year. Do you mean the biggest conversion is happening in those young lambs grazing and also on the mother's milk? We then have wean lambs growing and finishing cattle come in terms of this is prioritising the best quality feed. Young calves, animals gaining body condition is important. Again, may not have many of them at this time of year. Cows and calves a little bit further back, just because the suckler cow has a really valuable role in converting slightly rougher feed into milk for the calves, and they are better able to withstand slight variation in quality than particularly ewes and lambs. So that's why they're slightly lower down. Ewes around tupping, cows and calves around bulling. So again, during that time is coming up for certain people, spring calving, and then dry stock and fat dry stock. So the other thing to think about is that if you are losing quality on certain bits of your farm, it could be that when weaning does happen, which is for certain, I know for some they've only just finished lambing, but for certain systems weaning is going to happen in the next sort of 4, 6, 8 weeks. It could be that those fields aren't perfect now, but actually with a big group of fat weaned ewes, they can do a very good job tidying that up for as long as it's reset for the autumn. And then it's just about thinking about what the range of options that you have available. So this is just indicating that all of these grazing systems could be applied on a farm at certain times of year, and it's just about thinking which is the most appropriate for which area. So we've got to be managing almost continuous grazing, so the sward height is maintained. You've got sort of more gentle shifts, maybe shifting every week through a series of paddocks, and then you've got more intensive grazing, and it could be that you're using them for different types of stock at different points of the year. But the key thing to remember is as grass starts to slow down, you have to slow the rotation just to give it a chance to catch up with itself. And that's really driven by this sort of rest and recovery period that we've talked about, that you're trying to get the grass that has been grazed and needs to grow back to give it the most chance possible to go through these various stages to make sure it's at that third leaf stage before those animals return. And so in terms of thinking about what can we do differently for next year, and I know I'm not wishing this, well, some of us are wishing this year away, but so is there options in terms of carrying more grass through the winter? So is it about having a closing plan where you shut off a proportion of that farm through that winter to allow you that grass to have some recovery time and actually bring more grass through the winter that way? You could also feed in mid-pregnancy rather than necessarily in lactation, and that allows you to sort of by feeding at that stage, it means that you can then save grass for sort of late pregnancy into lactation. It could be that you need to put some forage crops in. You might have a field that needs reseeding, and so forage crops could be a way of getting extra feed into that winter time, and again allowing you to save grass to take it through to the spring. It could be that you need to have, I know it's dependent on ground conditions, but again earlier fertiliser applications may be useful, and again soil test and make sure your pH, P and K levels are appropriate, and that again will influence how that fertiliser is how efficiently it's being used. And also by potentially moving into, if you are doing rotational grazing with ewes and lambs and are confident with those systems, or cows and calves, it may be using it earlier to try and sort of make sure that grass has a rest period, allow it to recover. And that's particularly applicable for when grass growth has been struggling. So really in summary is that in I sort of said earlier, which is in this period of really variable grass supply, which is what we've experienced this spring, and it's been variable for a range of reasons, as I've explained, this more frequent measurement is useful. So whether with a sward stick or a plate meter, just to see what's going and is it going up or down, because things can change quite rapidly this time of year, and especially as your requirements are changing, as lambs are growing, calves are growing, that requirement will change. What we're also aiming to do is prioritise maintaining quality in most of the fields. So if 1 or 2 fields get out of control, that's better than all of quality being lost across the entire farm. And again, as I said, there's techniques to bringing in weaned animals to tidy up those paddocks later in the spring, later in the summer. And we're always looking for this green leaf and minimal stem, and that's what's really going to drive animal performance on. And I've said a couple of times, rest and recovery is very important. And just to, I'm also working with Hugh, and just a quick update from him. So he sort of experienced this. So he's had sort of dry, and so limiting grass growth. But it's rained with him in the last few days, and so he's expecting this big surge in terms of grass growth. He's currently got 2 rotations of cows and calves out, and he's just starting to allocate them into bulling groups. And he's just about to finish the first round of his rotation. And the challenge with him is some of that, by the time he's got all the way around that rotation, some of that grass has started to get quite long. So he has got some concerns about how to maintain those residuals. But again, he's got plans in terms of taking the excess out for silage and hay. And his objective really leading up to, so after bulling and leading up to weaning, is to start creeping, is dividing them up into female and male calves, and then start to creep his bull calves to try and make sure they've to be maximise growth rates at grass in the summertime. And that's what you do.